Oh, well, if you're gonna start, then I'll do that.
Well, we do it now, because I don't want to take.
Two different ducks that come up.
Okay, so let everybody know Captain Morrissey, USS retired.
All right, with our, last night, Bill and I were at a function together. And there was a lady there dressed with all the accoutrements of Christmas.
Yes, she was.
There was a star,
Many women,
yep,
including
star.
this one.
There was a star of Bethlehem, there were the three wise men, there were the shepherds of the sheep. And so I thought it'd be important that Bill tell her the true story of Christmas here. So I brought him up and I said, Bill, would you mind explaining to her why none of this happened and Christ really wasn't born in a stable, he was born in a basement and all this other stuff. Bill folded like a cheap tin. The man does not stand by his beliefs.
No, it's not true. I stood by it. I stood by it. Well, we're going to spend an hour on this Gospel of Thomas and where it came from, why it's important, and why this whole issue of Gnosticism is important. As I've said before, the church in the first several hundred years, 150 years, was very rich and very diverse. And there were many different denominations and different groups who believed different things. And of course you can see that. What did they have for a guide?
Nothing.
Nothing. Thank you. Basically nothing. Okay, but there are some key questions I want to start with this morning. And Bobby, I know you probably have the answers.
I doubt it.
And here's the first question. Did all the animals on Noah's Ark come in pairs?
Thought so.
At least.
No, the worms came in an apple.
Oh, it's too early in the morning.
And have you guys heard about the race between the lettuce, head of lettuce, and the tomatoes?
No.
The lettuce was ahead and the tomatoes were trying to catch up. See what you're learning in this morning? Now I'm giving you this important information so that when you're sitting with someone in the pews at Christmas, you can ask them these important questions.
No way you appreciate.
That's good. And the last question is, what do you call a sleepwalking nun? A Roman Catholic.
Oh,
Why did I come so early? I could have come later and avoided
Okay, so let's go to what's called 50. Hard to believe we've been through 52 slides, but let's go to this first one, 52. Does everybody know what Nag Hammadi was?
yes.
Everybody, you're speaking for everyone? Good.
She's been known to do that.
I know that. Well, in 1945, a shepherd found a whole series of codices in a cave. As a matter of fact, he found 13 leather-bound books. That's what a codex is. Before they were scrolls, but what they eventually did was they put them into books and they were actually sewed together. And found 13 leather-bound books that included about 52 different works. And these works included Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels like Thomas and Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Judas. Okay? And they also contain some other works that are less famous. The story is told that this shepherd who found these, because it was cold, took them back home and they were going to burn them to create heat in the fire. And luckily they didn't burn them. Okay, and that's why we have them. They were saved by Egyptian researchers, and that's how we got them today. Okay, and this Gospel of Thomas was one that was found. It's not to be confused with the other writings of Thomas. There's 114 sayings of Thomas that are in a list. And they're very different. And then there's the infancy gospel of Thomas, which is what we're going to take about today. And they're considered Gnostics because does everybody know what Gnosticism is? Because it was a big deal in the first 300 years of the church. Because it's almost considered a little heretical. Gnostics believe that we are divine souls trapped in a medieval and bad world. That we're good people trapped in this bad world, like architects feel sometimes. Right? Okay. And the world was made that we live in by an imperfect God. And the imperfect God, believe it or not, was the God of Abraham. The Deluge that we find in the Hebrew Bible. And this led to different kinds of beliefs, and one was a Gnostic belief by a priest by the name of Marcion, who believed that the God of the Hebrew Bible was inferior to the God of the New Testament, and therefore they weren't going to follow the Old Testament at all. It was also about secret knowledge, that it took certain secret knowledge to be able to raise above this and become a true spiritual person. And Jesus was this spiritual person. Well, of course, this is very foreign to what Orthodoxy eventually told us about the church and about Jesus. And so eventually what happened was the Gnostics were pushed down by the Orthodox bishops who wanted orthodoxy. And particularly in 197 CE, a bishop by the name of Irenaeus, okay, took a lot of these Gnostic works and says, they're out. We are just going to focus on what we think is true orthodoxy. And almost every one of these Gnostic traditions were faded into oblivion. Do you think there's any modern day Gnostics? I'll give you one. The Course in Miracles. Ever hear of the Course in Miracles?
Yeah.
That would be an example of modern day Gnosticism. Okay? So the Gnostics lost favor, even though they brought a lot of enrichment to the church. Some people think these codices that were found, these leather-bound codices in Nag Hammadi, were buried there by a deacon, believe it or not, after Constantine in 387, because they were considered, and he became a bishop, by the way. It can happen. Not anymore, but it can happen. But that they were buried there because they were considered heretical. Okay, and so rather than burn them, which they did a lot of these ancient documents, they were hidden in these caves, like they were in the Quran to the south.
Okay, Bill,
Okay.
a question. So the Gnostics were Christians.
Yep.
But out of the Jewish,
Yep. Everyone was Jewish, tremendous
yes,
Jewish
I know.
traditions.
But
Or the Gentiles did, because remember, there were Gentiles who were not Jews, who followed the way. What was early Christianity, as we call it? What was the sect called? The method called? It was called the Way. It was called the Way. So it was both. It was both. There were people who came out of the Jewish segment, okay, and who were also Gentiles.
but this idea of that the world was made by an imperfect God would have been, I mean, the Jewish,
No, it wouldn't have been Jewish. They would have been Gentiles.
they would have converted.
Yeah. Matter of fact, I've done a course just on Gnosticism, and when you see all these different beliefs, like Docetism, which I'll touch on, Jesus could not have possibly been human, because then he couldn't have been resurrected. The difference between being human and being, divine. Okay, yeah, Bob?
Bill, were the Essenes considered Gnostics too? Because like Mary Lynn today preached on, what's his name?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist, thank you. And John the Baptist.
He was
who-
probably an Essene.
Yeah. Were they considered Gnostics?
No,
No.
they were not yet. That was really early, remember. That was like 30, 40 AD or CE. So the Gnosticism
Okay, that was-
came later.
Yeah, that's right.
But
Would've-
the Essenes were a response to the Jewish zealots. Remember, there were three Jewish groups. One was those who were the Pharisees, who followed Rome and basically supported the emperor and were always making the deal that they could follow their religion as long as they paid their taxes. The emperor would leave them alone, Helen, because that's all they really wanted. That's all Herod was charged to do: collect taxes and keep the peace. Okay, that was one group. There was a group of Israelites who didn't believe in that at all. They were opposed to Rome, and they were called the Zealots. They were the ones who eventually got the temple overthrown in 70 CE, okay, and the Great War of 67 CE. And there was a third group. The third group says, I'm not a Jewish zealot, I'm not going to fight Rome, okay, and I'm not going to be a Pharisee and make a deal like they have. I'm going to retreat into the desert and practice my spirituality. Guess who that was? The Essenes. And so when you go down to Qumran, okay, and you see all their writing tables and the things they had down there, okay, you see that's what they were doing. And I believe John the Baptist was probably one of these Essenes who lived in the desert.
Thank you.
So those three groups are good. The Essenes were, of course, we found almost the entire Hebrew Bible that they had stored in caves down there. And the reason they survived so long until we found them was because the desert is very dry. The desert is very dry. They found the entire Psalms, all the Psalms down there. And there's just not, 150 Psalms, there's many more. Matter of fact, some of you have heard the story, but for those who haven't, I'll repeat it. My Hebrew Bible scholar and professor was Dr. James Sanders, and he was one that opened the Dead Sea Scrolls, was one of the scholars who did that. And he tells the story about how when they were in this pressurized room in Tel Aviv, having collected all of these scrolls, and the big problem was, how do you open them and not ruin them? Okay? And they went through study after study, Mark, about how to do this. Maybe using UV, using radar, using all kinds of stuff. And finally, he's there by himself one night, and he takes out his Swiss Army knife, and he starts cutting them apart little by little, and found out it worked. And so that's the technique they actually used to open many of the scrolls, with an X-Acto knife or a Swiss Army knife. So let's go to slide 53. We'll get back at the Thomas Hebrew word in a minute. Many of these stories were transmitted by oral tradition, right? Only about 5% of the population could read. And so the oral stories were passed along one to another, and they were eventually written down. It was this Bishop Irenaeus, who died in 187, who essentially said that these Gnostic works were all forgeries. They didn't conform to the true understanding of Jesus, and so anyway, they were considered heretical, okay? And they were not to be used and not to be followed, okay? Most people think this Gospel of Thomas came about in the 2nd century, maybe the 3rd century. That's where most of these Gnostic writings came from. They were beginning to say, this is our understanding of who Jesus was. And we even have that today, right? The Presbyterians have a different understanding of who gets saved and who doesn't than we Episcopalians do. I'm not picking on anybody a former Presbyterian here. I don't want to pick on. They believe in something called predestination. That there's only certain people who are predestined to be saved. Would we believe that in the Episcopal Church? No. We would believe that that's one of the great gifts of Christianity, one of the gifts of God, that everyone is saved. So we saw these differences early on, okay? So we don't know exactly when this gospel was written. Some people think early, some people think later. But it did not match up with the other gospels, although it does have the story about Jesus at the temple when he's 12. So what is that story from Luke 9? Mary takes Jesus to the temple at the age of 9, at the age of 12, and we find out that Jesus lectures them. Mary can't find him. Mary comes along and finally finds it and says, "Where were you?" And he says, "Woman, I was with my father." Now, a lot of women look at that statement and say that's really arrogant. Helen, would you? Rude, okay. But that was actually common language in that day, unfortunately. We can't judge our standards today by what we read in Scripture. Remember, it was written by them in their time for how they understood it, right? Okay, and we then try to exegete that forward. That means understand it in our context today, okay, which is very, very different. What can be. That's why it's very hard. We're going to go to 54. That's why it's very hard when people say, "The Bible has all the answers for me." I'm not so sure. Okay, because we understand it differently, right? And it has many inconsistencies. So, one of the things that they look at when we look at these other Gospels that were written, Thomas in particular, do we think it was written by Thomas? Probably not. It was written by some guy named Thomas. The same thing is pretty much true for the other Gospels. Do we think that John was really written by the evangelist John? Or that Matthew was written by a tax collector and the evangelist Matthew? Okay? Or that Mark, who was not an evangelist, right, but traveled with Barnabas and Paul, okay? No, because there's no identifiable proclamation to say, like Paul did, "I, Paul." Okay? The only one we think probably was written by Luke, because he writes to Theophilus, okay? And in Acts, he says, "in my previous work." And the Greek is the same. Pretty much written in the same way. It's why when we look at the Revelation, and people say, "Well, the evangelist John wrote Revelation." Who said? Who said? He starts off by saying, "I, John." It's a common name. It didn't say, "I, John, the evangelist." And there's another point. There's something called literary criticism, whereby we look at the works as literature. And the Greek in Revelation is very different than the Greek in the Gospel of John. Very different style of Greek. It's a very high level Greek in the Gospel of John.
Bill, does the writing style between the two Gospels of Thomas, do we think they're probably written by the same person?
No,
Two different styles, then there.
two different styles. Remember, this was people writing later. So one of the tests was when something was put into practice, and if it was a true gospel, that the bishop would use what we would call the doctors of the church. Okay, was it written in the 1st century? That makes sense, right? Because if you wrote something, let's say, Ron, you were going to write about the Trump administration. You want to do that?
That'd be a quick book.
But if you wrote it within the first few years, you'd have a much better chance of it being accurate than if you wrote it 200 years from now. Because we throw around hundreds of years like it's nothing. 1st century, 3rd century. So it's probably not that accurate. So the first thing is, was it written early? The second thing is, there's a conflict with the other Gospels. Okay? The Gospel of Thomas radically conflicts with the other Gospels. It's very different. It's only got that one birth narrative story in it about Jesus at the temple. And what the Gospel of Thomas tries to do is answer Helen's question. And I'm only doing this about Thomas because of Helen. She asked me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hope you're happy, Helen.
She asked, where was Jesus between the time he was in the temple at 12 and he started his ministry at approximately the age of 30? Where do you think he was?
Just kind of hanging
We have
around.
no idea.
Hanging around. Some people say he went to Egypt. Probably Some people said he was in Ethiopia. Probably not. The highest probability for what we think is true is he was working with his father. Okay, working with his father. And his father, if you translate the Greek, it's translated that he was a carpenter, but it's really not quite a carpenter. It's more like a tradesman today. Wouldn't be exactly carpenter. And why do we think that? Because if we look at the writings of other historians, like Josephus, we find out that all young men wound up being trained by their fathers in some craft or in agriculture. It was just a common thing to do, unless you were going to be a rabbi, and maybe you were trained by then another rabbi or Gamaliel or one of those. So that's probably, and you stayed close to home. So he probably was in Galilee doing that. So this Gospel of Thomas attempts to fill in that gap. You find in this Gospel of Thomas exactly that story, that first story that we see in Luke, okay, about him being at the temple and mom looking for us. But there's a big twist in this gospel, which is what makes it fun. Jesus is not 55. Jesus is not viewed in a very positive way. He is viewed as a child prodigy who could work miracles, who had a lot of power and could do miracles, but he was viewed as a danger to the community. He threw kids off roofs when he didn't like them. He was constantly arguing with his father and with others. Okay? And so the profile we see in Thomas of Jesus doesn't fit the other Gospels. So what would you do if you were starting a new religion and you were a bishop and you saw this? You'd say, we're not going to pay any attention to that one, right? And that's exactly what happened. They didn't pay any attention to that. So he's kind of viewed as a put it in here for you, he's kind of viewed like as a Harry Potter. So if you want to see what was Jesus like in his juvenile years, Danny was like Harry Potter. You know, he was kind of a specialist in training who could do miracles. But the other thing is, this Gospel of Thomas, there's something else fascinating. It does reflect on the Gospel of John. And what do we see in the Gospel of John? That's the spiritual Gospel of the four. But in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the Word of God. I'm going to preach about this on the 30th. So we'll be doing both things. So that Jesus was pre-eternal. He existed before. Right? And that's an important point. So if you want to have some fun, come on and hear me preach on the 30th, because I'm going to preach about Nintendo. You? Costco? And the border crisis all put together. That should pique your interest. Right? So anyway, there is the hint of him being pre-eternal. But if you kind of view him as a Harry Potter, you're probably close. Yeah, BJ.
So where was he between when Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt and 12? Because you talked about where he
Yeah.
was from 12 to 30.
Disappeared. After he's baptized, we don't hear much more.
And then
Thomas talks about that a little bit. Yes, they do. Thomas has got some of that in there. I'm not saying it started where Luke started at the age of 12, because there's one story in there about when he was a child, and I'm going to get to it here, where he made 12 sparrows out of clay, okay, and then released them, okay, which was kind of an analogy to the 12 apostles, okay. So it shows Jesus as already having special powers, but having the mind of a child. But don't get worried. Don't worry. You look like you're worried over there.
Oh, I worry a lot, yeah.
Don't worry, because it turns out okay. At the end of the Gospel of Thomas, he matures, he becomes the Jesus that we know and love, and everything is good.
Do you think there's any possibility, because the pagan gods all had lots of failings, you know, they
Yeah,
weren't,
yeah.
you think this was
Yeah.
but perhaps an attempt to
understand in our time and in our lives, right? We write how we understand it, right? So one of the things we saw in Luke and we saw in Matthew in the previous weeks, the story about Jesus escaping to Egypt in Luke parallels the Exodus story with Moses, right? Okay, following the star of Bethlehem. This is your shot, Dan.
I've already said what I think.
We can't find that star. We can go back historically and through astronomy, can't find it. But what happened during the 40 years in the desert? What did they follow?
Pillar of fire by night.
The fire by night, the tabernacle. So if you heard the story about following the star, following something miraculous, would that make sense if you were a Jew? Yeah, it would be like changing that story in that way. So anyway, it's really quite interesting. So let's look at some of the things that he talked about. Okay, we'll go to 57. What this gospel is doing is addressing docetic issues. Does everybody know what docetism is? It's one of those Gnostic beliefs. Okay? That Christ could not have been human. Remember, what did they fight about for 350 years? Was Christ fully human? Couldn't have been fully human. Okay? Was Christ fully divine? He certainly wasn't divine if he died on a cross. So how could he be divine? The Muslims who recognize Jesus as a prophet say that he somehow escaped to the cross and that really wasn't him. Okay? Docetism is this belief that the suffering of Jesus on the cross wasn't real, that it wasn't real, and that he couldn't be fully human and fully divine. So for 300 years, the church argued about whether he was fully human and fully divine or not human and not divine. And there were different Gnostic views that followed him in that way. And finally, it was at the Council of Nicaea, after Constantine, and they came up with the idea that Christ was both fully human and fully divine. Very complicated, right? It is complicated. It is complicated, but fully human and fully divine. So anyway, we see Jesus having a lot of failings. Okay, we see hints of pre-existence, like in John. We see these Gnostic flavors that the world is a bad place, and you have these special knowledge. And there's a scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman, who we have talked about a lot on Wednesday mornings from Chapel Hill, right, Bart? Ehrman's from Chapel Hill. Yeah.
Yes.
Who's a
North Carolina.
New Testament theologian and professor at Chapel Hill. And he's in the crowd, which I'm in, which was that, this gospel didn't mean much. It doesn't have very much to do with the original gospels, okay? But early Christians were trying hard to figure out what this thing they believed in was. We've got the benefit of 2,000 years of history. But imagine you're in the 1st or 2nd century. What do you have to guide your this new way? Not much. Not much. And not only that, only 5% of the population could read and write. So people were searching for answers. Okay? And we see Paul struggling that in Corinth, right? He's talking about not following Apollo. Right? You see that same kind of struggle with what to believe in. And it's interesting that even yet today we kind of have that same struggle, right? Within different. How many Christian sects or religion do we find in the world today if we start counting?
Christian?
Christian.
1,000.
I've heard that there's 30 to 40,000.
30 to 40,000. So just think about that. Just think about that. We only tend to think of the major denominations. Okay, so it probably really, honestly, is a fictional account, but it's fun It's fun to read. There are arguments by people who say that it could have been written in the first century just because we found it in 1945 and carbon dated it back to the 2nd century, and it sounds like a 2nd century document. Does that mean the first version was written in the 2nd century? Not necessarily, right? It could have been written earlier, and that was a copy. Could have been written there again. So this whole docetism thing is interesting, is that Christ only seemed human. He had to be divine. And he only appeared to die. That's what we read in the Quran, right? That he didn't really die.
read the Quran.
What?
I haven't
I
really
thought
read
everybody here read the Quran.
Not me.
No?
I've read parts of it, but not
Parts,
cover to
yeah.
cover.
He only appeared to you. Okay. Matter of fact, in the Quran we read that Christ left before the crucifixion. So you see, there really are a lot of different views. So the gospel opens with Thomas saying, "I, Thomas, the Israelite, announce and make known to you all, brothers, from among the Gentiles, the mighty deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ, which he did when he was born in our land." Oh boy, this is going to be good. 1-1. We first see Jesus at the age of 5, well, 7 years before going to the temple, playing in a brook on the Sabbath, making 12 clay sparrows. When Jesus is rebuked for doing what? Working on the Sabbath. He claps his hands and the sparrows fly away, showing that he had power like Harry Potter. This is the Harry Potter story, right? Okay, and this has been interpreted as probably signs of relating it to the 12 apostles. Okay, in another story, Annas the scribe disperses water Jesus had collected. Okay, and he is made by Jesus to wither and die. That wasn't nice. And that's possible parallel to the withering fig tree. So whoever wrote this was smart enough to put a little bit of truth into it and stories that people could relate to, like fake news. What's behind fake news? You put and a lot of stories. If you put a little bit of truth in the story, right? You've never done this, right? No. If you put a little bit of truth in the story, people tend to maybe believe the whole story because they focus on just that little bit of truth, even though the rest of it can be completely in error, completely a fallacy. My personal favorite, when a boy bumps into Jesus, he is zapped dead. That wasn't nice either, was it, Mark? Zapped dead. Okay. And others who offended Jesus from time to time are blinded. But the good news is, at the end of the gospel, they're brought back to life and their vision is restored. So everything, don't get nervous, everything turns out good in the end. Everything turns out good in the end.
What if you didn't read it to the end?
What?
What if you didn't read it to the end?
Then you got a problem.
The kid really has a problem.
Yeah, there you go. Are you familiar with the story in Acts about Euclides? Euclides in Acts 20. Paul's in Troas, right? And he's preaching to the crowd, okay? And there's a man called Euclides sitting on a windowsill, and he falls asleep. Remember? And he falls 3 stories. And you figure he died, right? Not good to fall 3 stories. Paul goes down there and says, it's okay, he's alive. So Paul brings him back. Okay, Paul brings him back. So that's a story you would have known about. So whoever wrote Thomas wrote something very similar. Okay? Whereby at the age of 6, Jesus is reported to have carried water in his outer garments when the pitcher broke in his pockets. And when he is 8, there's a reported miracle of him sowing wheat in the field. that yielded 100-fold times the grain leading of the day, okay? And when his half-brother James, which is true, is bitten by a viper, he comes to no harm, the same way when Paul is written. So there's these parallel stories that kind of are half-truths and reflect what we read in the epistles. So it's that old trick that was used by scholars in those days. And by the way, plagiarism was very common. Matter of fact, that's why there's confusion about some of the letters from Paul, particularly the epistles of Timothy and Titus and what have you, because they don't really sound like Paul, but someone probably wrote them to sound like Paul, because you got credit for that. You was a great scholar. So 3:1. When he was going from there with his father Joseph, a child running tore into his shoulder. And Jesus said to him, "You shall no longer go our way." And instantly he died. Not good. At once the people, seeing that he was dead, cried out and said, "Where was this boy born, that his word becomes deed?" That'll wake you. That'll preach. That'll preach. When they saw what had happened, the parents of the dead boy blamed his father Joseph, saying, "Because you have this boy, you cannot live with us in this village. If you wish to be here, teach him to bless and not to curse."
Sounds like a juvenile delinquent.
And Joseph said to Jesus, "Why do you say such things? They suffer and hate us." And the boy said to Joseph, "If the words of my father were not wise, he would not know how to instruct children." And again he said, "If these children of the bridal chamber, they would receive curses. These people shall receive their punishment." Instantly the ones accusing him were blinded. That's not good either, is it? But Joseph became angry and took hold of his ear and pulled hard. And Jesus said to him, "Is it enough for you to seek me and to find me? You have acted foolishly, Father." So he's telling his father, knock it off here a little bit, Dad. You know, this may not turn out too good for you either. A teacher named Zacchaeus was standing listening to Jesus saying these things to his father. And he said, "Oh, wicked boy." He said to Joseph, "Come bring him, brother, so that we may learn to love those his own age. Honor old age," keep that in mind, "and revere elders, so that he may acquire a desire to be among children, also teaching them in return." But Joseph said to the teacher, "Who is able to restrain this child and teach him? Do not consider him to be a small cross, brother." In other words, this kid's a problem. And at the temple, finally there's an account of Jesus in the temple, okay, and it's in the interest of the words used by Elizabeth, okay. "Blessed are you among women, because God has blessed the fruit of your womb." But adding the words, "for such glory and such excellence and wisdom we have never seen or heard." So he gets better as he gets older. But you want to ask, why would the Gnostics want to write something even like this? Because if you believe about what's true of Gnosticism, what we believe is that you believe in a world created by an inferior God. The world is a bad place, and it takes special knowledge, which is what Gnosticism is all about, and additional spirituality provided by Jesus to raise up out of it. So this parallels that, right? This is a bad world we got. This, and eventually it turns out okay. I put backup slides in here for you which you may not get to the mall. But,
It just seems like a difficult way to teach. I mean,
yeah,
you're
yeah.
trying to teach morality, but none of those
Well, that's-
stories are gonna
Well,
back
this
it
is
up.
why the fathers of the church said this can't be canonical. Because it was inconsistent, I believe.
Bill, it seems that a lot of the things you were telling us here, were in that movie, The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of it was picked up that way. You know, it's a little bit like fake news again, right? You pick some good stuff and you put it in there and some of it becomes true. Go to 72, this is one of the backup slides I have for you, it's kind of interesting. Thomas and his teacher. Now when they seemed to be comforted by the boy's consolation, the teacher said to his father, "Come bring him into the school, and I shall teach him letters." And the schoolmaster, flattening him, took him into the classroom. But Jesus was silent. And Zacchaeus wrote the alphabet for him and began to teach the letters. And he would repeat a letter to him frequently. But the boy did not answer him. Notice it doesn't say Jesus, it says the boy did not answer him. Becoming irritated, the teacher struck him on the head. And the boy became angry and said to him, "A smith's anvil, when struck, teaches whoever strikes it. It is not the anvil which is taught. I know the letters which you are teaching more accurately and far better than you." To me, these things are like, you'll recognize this, like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal, which do not represent the sound, nor the glory or the power of understanding. You've heard that? So that's where it comes from. Believe it or not, it comes from the Gospel of Thomas. And then we'll just go to 73. This is about pre-existence. And after the teacher heard such a description and such lines of the first letter, Jesus had expressed he was puzzled about such teaching and his defense. And the teacher said, "Woe is me, for I have brought shame down upon myself. Take this boy away from me, brother. This boy simply is not of this earth. He can even tame fire. Perhaps this boy existed before the flood of Noah." Pre-existence, right? Like in John. Okay? What kind of womb bore him? What kind of mother reared him? I do not know. Woe is me, brother. He stupefies me. I cannot follow along in my mind. I have deceived myself. Thrice unhappy as I am, I thought to gain a student, and I am found having a master. So you see how now there's a little, you're beginning to see this shift. So this is just a little glance at the Gospel of Thomas. What do you think? Now, you're all great theologians. What is theology?
Study of God.
There's a famous philosopher who I think put it really well, and this is a nice thing to keep in mind. Faith seeking understanding. Right? Think about that. Faith seeking understanding. McGrath did that. And so, if you are all scholars, if you are all world famous theologians, and it's the 2nd century, and you got this Gospel of Thomas, and there are others, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, that says that Mary was in love with Jesus, Jesus was in love with Mary. There's even a scroll that was found called the Copper Scroll, that was a treasure map that people have been looking for a long time. Would you let this in the canon? Do you think it should be in the canon? Well,
Well, it was even stronger than not letting it be in the canons, right? It was, we're burning all these copies, it's heretical, right? So we're burning all of them, and somebody happened to hide some of them that we
Yeah.
didn't find for
That's
2,000
right.
years.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Because remember, this first couple of 100 years of the church, there was this tremendous struggle in the church about what was right belief.
And orthodoxy won out.
And orthodoxy won out.
And that's basically the Catholic Church.
That's basically the Catholic Church. And it was that way. And remember, the church grew up in the East, not in the West. It was that way until what? The
Reformation.
The Reformation. And some people would say we're going through another Reformation today. An Episcopal historian by the name of Phyllis Tickle, who passed away a couple of years ago, was a pretty good friend of mine. And she wrote several books, a lot of books. And one of the things she wrote about was about how the church changes about every 500 years. It goes through a cycle. And she goes back and she makes the first point about the fall of Rome in 476, okay, when Rome fell and the temple fell. And then when Jesus was born 500 years later in 0 AD, 500 years after that, it was about Constantine. And then finally in 1000 AD or thereabouts, 1100, was the Great Schism between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Church. And then the Reformation in the 15th century and today. And her point was that the church is going through a reformation of sorts today. And you can see that in the world, right? What's very popular today? Being spiritual but not religious. People will say, I'm spiritual, I just am not religious. And when you see, the challenges the Roman Church has, okay, and other churches, I mean, you can see why a lot of people would say, why do I want to be affiliated with that? But I'm spiritual. I think we're spiritual beings. So the spiritual but not religious are one of the fastest growing groups in the country, BJ. Growing at 2 to 3% per year, and about 12% of the population today in the U.S. consider themselves spiritual. They're not religious. The other fastest growing group are the nuns, not the one I talked about earlier. The N-O-N-E-S, nuns. No religious affiliation. The people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, but I want nothing to do with that church. And those are two very big groups today. So there's people still searching for what spirituality is to them, just like they were doing during the Reformation, right? During the Reformation, there were people like Luther was saying that the church has failed the people of God with indulgences and with many other things, right? And the counter-reformers in the Catholic Church were who?
Jesuits.
The Jesuits. That's where the Jesuits came to be. And they became very highly educated, and even today they're extremely highly educated. So people were searching then for how to reform the church. And I think it's the struggle that we see here today, right? We look at the world today and we say, what do we do to get more people in church? How come every denomination, the Episcopal Church, is losing membership at the rate of 2% per year? When the country had a population of 180 million in the 1950s, okay, we had about 7 million members in the Episcopal Church. Today, we have 350 million thereabouts, right? And we got 1.7 million. So you see, it's constantly shifting. Dan.
I also think of our own country, Bill. We go back to what I'm not sure the year around 1800, early 1800, the religious awakening of Joseph.
The Great
Smith
Awakening.
And Joseph Smith, the Mormon, Mary Baker Eddy, with the Christian
Yeah.
Scientists, and all the other lot of
Wilbercross and Whitehead and those guys, the Great Spiritual Awakening. Yeah, and then you look at the Great Awakening in the 30s with the camp meetings, and that's where we began to see people taking scripture inerrantly. Everybody know what I mean, inerrantly? That it's without error. And we know it's got errors in it. We saw a lot of that in the last couple of weeks. Doesn't mean the message isn't true, but we still see those errors. So we're going through this. We really are. All of us in this room are going through this today. You know, what does the church need to do to attract more guys like him? Really? Right? What does it need? What do you think it needs to do? But you know, it's a fair question. It's a fair question, and it's one that we're all struggling with. one of my favorites is we need to attract more youth to the church, because the youth are the future of the church. How many times have you heard the youth are the future of the church? I want you to view it differently. The youth are not the future of the church. The youth are the church today. Today. I'm not worried about 20 years from now. I'm worried about right now, today. You know, and that's an important issue, especially among millennials. Especially among millennials, or Generation Z. You Generation Z or you a millennial? Pick one you like.
How old is he?
Okay, so I hope this was interesting. Now, in 2 weeks,
I think so too.
I said I got to go to work. In 2 weeks, on the 30th, I'm preaching on the 30th. On the 30th and on the 6th of January, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Holy Land, a combined tour of the Holy Land. And I have a handout for you. It'll be part of a document that I work for every time we go to the Holy Land, and Mark's leading this trip. And I call it Walking in Their Sandals, okay? And I made a subset of that, so you can go on that pilgrimage, okay, right here virtually with us over a period of a couple of weeks, and see some of these places like the Church of the Nativity and what it's really like to go to the West Bank, you know? So, anyway, questions? We've got a couple of minutes, so we're done. Yeah, Bob.
So, right now, though, aren't we seeing growth in the non-mainline churches?
Here,
So like Maranatha as an example or something, you know,
You
here.
know, Maranatha
just-
is an example is a unique example, I think, but they're struggling as well. They're struggling as well. Not as much as mainline denominations like Episcopalians, Methodists, Lutherans, and what have you. The Roman Church has even got challenges, but what's keeping them going more than anything is the Hispanics, because there's a large degree of Hispanics, okay, and they're part of the church. But remember, the Roman Church basically keeps it going by kind of saying you're all sinners and you're all going to hell unless you go to confession, you know, and it's got this big anvil that it holds over people's head. We don't tend to do that. We don't tend to do that. You know,
The Roman Church also has a huge endowment.
huge endowment. He's a huge endowment. Yeah, that's true. Well, it's like that, I told you about maybe something you heard this, and I'll finish with this. This man decides after being away from the church for many, many years to go back to the church, back to the Roman church. He's going to go back to church. So what do you have to do to go back to church? You got to go to confession. So he goes into the confessional, and what does he see? He sees the finest liquor, the finest scotch, the finest bourbon, all these things on the wall that he never saw before. And so the priest walks in, and he says to the priest, he says, you know, last time I went to confession, you didn't have all this alcohol on the wall, all these high-end snacks and caviar and everything else. And the priest says to him, yeah, that's because you're on the wrong side. Okay, guys, I gotta go to work. Let's go worship. See you guys.